jump right in to what was a big recruiting weekend. I feel like we say this a lot with you. You know, Fran picked up some more recruits. Of the guys who he just brought in, you know, who just got commitments from, who's the name that we need to know most about? Who's the biggest one on the list?
I think it's Chase Geter, the cornerback from Virginia. He's one of the best defensive backs in the East this cycle, and he had a bunch of power conference offers. I think Duke thought they were in a really good spot with him before he came up and visited Syracuse. And in-state schools like Virginia Tech were after him pretty hard. He had an official visit originally scheduled to Michigan for this past weekend, but didn't end up taking it. So I think the fact that, you know, a school like that's after him tells you a little bit about how talented he is. And then the other guy that I would mention is Carter Bashir, tight end from the Philadelphia area. I know he's not, you know, he's not rated at all at the moment. He'll be evaluated in the future, but a little bit under the radar in terms of his rating, but athletic, a lot of upside there. I think someone that in a couple of years you could see contributing at a pretty high level. I think the potential for him is pretty high.
What do you think would be a good retention of these commits for Syracuse? You know, how many do you expect to like flip, or, you know, and it could be for any school. What do you think a good retention of a commitment is?
I think if you keep about 80%, 90% of the players that have committed to your school in a given cycle, you feel pretty good about that. And I know that decommitments and flips and all those types of things happen to basically every school, every recruiting cycle. But from a percentage standpoint, you know, if you get 25 to 30 commits, usually you only have a couple of players that will decommit during that cycle or flip to other schools. So, you know, Syracuse, I think, in the past hasn't dealt with that a ton, mainly because the guys that they have been going after haven't been of the same caliber in terms of recruiting acumen and profiles and rankings and all that as what Fran Brown is going after. So when you've got 3 or 4 guys from Florida who are 4-star prospects committed to your school, yeah, you're still going to get a bunch of schools continuing to go after those guys, and that's what's happened. But, you know, to date, I think Syracuse only has the one guy that decommitted today, Jackson Gates. Florida guys have all stayed committed, but, of course, you know, those other schools aren't going to stop until signing day.
You mentioned Jackson Gates, so let's go there next. Is this a big deal, or, you know, do you have any intel on what happened, I guess, here in this situation?
You know, it's kind of interesting because when he visited, not this past weekend, but the weekend before, I talked to him after, and he's like, you know, hey, it reminded me why I committed, told me he was solidified as being part of Syracuse's class, and then said he wanted the Syracuse visit to be his last visit, but BYU wanted him to come up, so he told him he would. And so it sounded like everything was good. He was just going to go on that BYU trip just to go on it and sort of round out his visits, but afterwards he ends up decommitting. I think this is really nothing other than BYU is a lot closer to home. He's from California. He was a very early commit to Syracuse before his recruitment kind of blew up, and he got a bunch of Power 4 offers after that. And I really think it's just one of those things that happens. The good thing for Syracuse is, as I mentioned, they got Chase Geter. They have other defensive backs who are committed, who they think very highly of. They're after other guys like Tadarius Hughes. He's a safety, not a corner, but even still a defensive back who's another kid from Florida who's a 4-star, even though he is currently committed to Florida State. So from a secondary standpoint, I think they'll be okay. You never like losing players, but I think Syracuse will be fine in this cycle.
Let's go back to Carter Bashir for a minute. 6'5", 250. Like that's he's a big boy. What is his skill set, and do you, like, at that size, do you envision a position change at all in his future, or do you think he comes here as a tight end?
I think he's going to come as a tight end. Now, does that mean that he couldn't add, 40 pounds and, potentially grow an inch or two and then transition to tackle and be a really athletic tackle? I'd never rule that out. But I think he's going to come in initially as a tight end, and even though he's 250, he still moves really well for that size. So I think someone that can use that frame to his advantage as a receiver and then is big enough to be a good tight end that can kind of be that traditional guy that can line up at the line of scrimmage, pass protect, go out in some routes, and then, potentially even move back to be like an H-back, play the fullback a little bit. I think he's got some versatility there, but, I think there's still some rawness to him in his game, especially, as a route runner and technician, as a pass catcher. But I think there's a lot to like there and a lot of upside there.
They went out and got another kicker, already got a commitment from the top punter in the country. Now they go out and land a kicker. Your thoughts on it's obviously a position in need, right? They're trying to figure that out moving forward, and you've got to have strong special teams, and it sounds like they're making that a priority.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because not necessarily at Syracuse, but just in general, with the scholarship limit at 85 previously, that teams were much more reluctant to offer a scholarship to a kicker or punter and specialists out of high school. Now that it's up to, the 105 with the House settlement, Syracuse has seemed to be much more willing to do that. I think they've been on the forefront of that the last couple of recruiting cycles. So, the fact that they got the number one punter in the country, they found a Northeast kid as a kicker who, also had interest and was being recruited by other Power 4 schools. They're prioritizing special teams, and I think you can see the proof in the pudding and the way that they're recruiting as well.
One other guy I want to ask you about, Tyrell Grant Jr., listed as an athlete, committed rather last week to Syracuse. What position is he projected to play? What are you looking at for him?
He's going to be someone that comes into the secondary, plays defensive back. Exactly what position? My guess right now, this is just a guess on my part, is he ends up at safety. But I think they're going to try him all over the secondary, see where he can play. But he plays quarterback in high school. Does a lot of different things at the high school level. So he's a really athletic, really talented kid, and someone that came up and got an offer after a strong performance at camp. He worked out at defensive back exclusively during the camp, and Syracuse got him up for an official visit, and he committed shortly thereafter. So they really liked what they saw from him in person and think that he projects into the secondary pretty well as someone who could play safety, drop down and play nickel, and then has the potential to develop as a boundary corner as well.
We talked a little bit earlier in the show that, Syracuse right now is ranked 28th in the country in 2026 in recruiting, but 10th in the ACC. How should Syracuse fans feel about this, the fact that they're 10th in the ACC, but top 30 nationally?
I think you look at it from two perspectives. One, you'd like to be a little higher within your own conference. The other thing to remember is there's more teams in the ACC now, so it's not like it's 10 out of 14. It's 10 out of 18, 10 out of 20, and as conferences keep expanding, being 10th in your conference isn't that big of a deal. But also, if you're worried about the future of the ACC and where is the talent going, the fact that you have 10 other teams in the top 30 ahead of you, I think tells you that the ACC overall is recruiting pretty well. And so that bodes well for the future of the conference and on-the-field product and all of that. But largely, you look at not just the recruiting rankings, not just the stars, but the measurables, the other power conference schools that are after the players you're getting, as well as how they fit into what you want systematically. And we talked about it last recruiting cycle with the offensive linemen they were getting. Byron Washington being the one that most point to, like 6'8", 380 or whatever his measurables were. Fran Brown knows what he's looking for. The players in the secondary all seem to be long. Most of them are track stars. He's looking for very specific things in what he wants at each position, and he's hitting those marks with the guys that he's getting.
Mike, anybody we should be looking out for, whether it's football or basketball right now in terms of recruiting?
One guy I've got my eye on is Ibn Muhammad, who is a defensive back who was up this past weekend. I think the visit went very well, so I'm keeping an eye on him. Syracuse is the best offer. See if Syracuse can close the deal there. And then really it's about the flips right now from a football recruiting standpoint, meaning there's a player who's originally from upstate New York, an offensive lineman named Xavier Payne, who had been committed to Florida State for a while. He decommitted over the weekend. He took an official visit this month to Syracuse. He also took one to Colorado. Who wins that battle, or does he keep things open and look at new schools down the road? Syracuse commits like Cameron Wilson, Jarius Rogers, Javion Cooper was on the Nebraska campus this past weekend. Can Syracuse hold on to those guys? I mentioned Darius Hughes, the safety that's committed to Florida State. And then they had a Vanderbilt defensive line commit, Darrell Campbell, on campus. He's from Texas. They had him on campus this weekend, too. So it's really just sort of monitoring those situations and seeing how successful Syracuse is at keeping its own players, as well as flipping players committed elsewhere.
All right, Mike. Great stuff as always. Appreciate you filling us in. Enjoy the start of your summer, and we'll talk again soon, hopefully next week.
Thanks, guys. I appreciate it.
All right. Mike McAllister joining us here on the show, and with that, we'll take a time out. Phone lines open if you want to check in, 315-437-7644. We will wrap up hour number one next on ESPN Radio.